Hey folks, Brandon here. Wanted to do this video to share with you some of the data that I collected on my last cross-country Tesla trip, which by the way, if you haven't checked out the videos, I have a 10-part video series, which is probably about 5 hours long in total, split up into about half an hour segments, covering my trip from Michigan to California and back. And this is the data that I accumulated, which isn't perfect because I forgot to record a few things here and there, but it's interesting. So yeah, so I started here in Grand Rapids, and then I ended up in Southern California. The closest supercharger to my destination was Rancho Cucamonga, and then these are all the stops in between. Starting from Michigan, going down through Illinois, and then across, well, sort of dipping into Missouri, and then across Kansas, Colorado, Utah, dipping down to Nevada, and finally California. So in this column, I have with each next stop, so this is the number of kilowatt hours it took to get there. This is the number of miles it was from the previous one. This is the watt-hour miles over that leg of the trip. And then this is the change in elevation. And I believe this is in feet here. Yeah. And then this is sort of how I arrived at the calculations, like the time when I started charging and then the time that I was done. Or sorry, here, yeah. Start and then done time. And then this is the, based on that, the total time charging. So first I'll start out down at the bottom of this column, total, oh wait, almost. I started in the middle of the day in Grand Rapids, and then the bold cities are the ones that I stayed in overnight. So Columbia, Missouri, I slept in the car at the supercharger, and then there's Silverthorne, Colorado, and then St. George, I stayed in hotels. So over those 3 nights, I did over 10 hours of charging time. If you drove this leg without stopping for anything, it would be about 31 hours of driving. And so added to that is 10 hours of charging. So that's about 1/3 of travel time charging adds, and this is supercharging. And then averaging that time over the number of stops that I did, I averaged about half an hour at each, which is pretty high compared to, the Tesla's claims of being, I don't know, what is it, like 20 minutes to 80% of your battery, which does not occur in the 70D, which I have. I'll talk about that later. So the main reason I wanted to do this was, one, to sort of have an idea of certain areas that needed more watt-hour per mile than others, and then also to sort of track the relationship between the change in the elevation. In other words, if I'm climbing up or I'm descending in elevation, how does that affect my energy use? So this is going east to west, and then I have a separate one that's going west to east. This is a chart that I had since the first time actually that I went out, and this is just distances. So here I'm starting at Grand Rapids, and the next stop is St. Joseph's, and each one of these is the absolute distance to the next destination. So. Oh yeah, this was the farthest one that I went, which is 184 miles. There's actually a stop in between Springfield and Columbia. I forget what it is. Oh, I think it actually might be. Is it no, it's not Independence. Well, anyway, I forget. But it sort of makes a triangle if you make that extra stop. But if you skip that and take the hypotenuse, it's 184 miles, which I made it in my 70D. Let's see. Yeah, so anyway, that's the distances. And then here is the absolute elevation in feet. So I started at 640, Then as I went westward, you get to the Rockies and you start super climbing all the way up to Silverthorne, where I stayed one night close to 9,000 feet. And then that goes down to Southern California. Okay, so here's where it gets interesting. This graph is energy use and altitude change. So the blue here is my watt hour per mile at each stop. So what I mean by that, so here's St. Joseph, Michigan. When getting to St. Joseph, Michigan, coming from Grand Rapids, which is on my way out to California, I used 328, and then the next stop, Country Club Hills, I used 249. The next stop was Normal, Illinois, which is 312 watt hours. Okay, on and on and on. So the blue here, these are my watt hours, and then the red or pinkish is the change in elevation. And this is in, let's see, yeah, it's in feet. And it's a little hard to, what I want to see is the change in the watt hour per mile with the variation in elevation. It's kind of hard to do that on a graph because the values for change in elevation are so high, and the differences are not nearly as stark. So it's kind of hard to show. So you can see out here where the change in elevation is like here it's a gain of 82 feet, a loss of 44 feet, gain of 200 feet, a loss of 300 feet, 330 feet. It's essentially insignificant in the variation of the watt hour per mile that I was using. Same thing here, but once you get to Kansas, there's some significant elevation changes. So getting to Hays was a change of 770 feet. That's like, I don't know, what, 220 meters or something like that for those of you across the pond. And then Goodland, Kansas, a gain of 1,600 feet. Lyman, and then another gain of 1,700. Here, did I forget to... oh, yeah, and then from eastern Colorado to Denver, there's hardly any change. And then here, there's a very stark gain in elevation from Denver to Silverthorne, although the distance to there is not that high. Let's see, here's Silverthorne. Yeah, it's only 84 miles from Denver to Silverthorne. Oops. Okay. So you notice that there's not a whole lot of change going on here, despite the change in elevation, until we get to the descent in the Colorado mountains. So going from Silverthorne to Glenwood Springs, that's a loss of almost 3,000 feet, which is by about 1,000 meters. And you can see my watt hour per mile is 185. And let me see, how far was that? Silverthorne to Glenwood Springs was 93 miles. So that is super low, 185 watt hours per mile. And then the next leg, it was still a loss of altitude, but not quite as much. And so I used a little bit more energy. Same thing with the next step, use a little bit more energy. And then here I gained elevation, and that sort of peaked out my use. And then let's see, getting down, let's see, from Beaver to St. George is a loss of 3,000. But what's interesting is that, like, I still use 279, you know, which is the same as, well, actually, okay, so that is a little bit lower than previously. So, yeah, and then these changes were a little less significant. I did do one, this is the same data, but in elevation change in meters, and then in watt hours per kilometer. And so it's pretty much the same information, it's just graphed a little bit different way. And you can kind of see it a little better with these ones. So again, with this huge decrease in elevation, you can see a pretty prominent change. So I did want to point out that even in some of these, I mean, the difference in some of these doesn't look that significant. But let's take like the difference between using 173 and 270 watt hours per kilometer. So let's see, let's bring up a calculator here. So the difference between 180 and 207, so 207 minus, well, so that's 27 watt hours per kilometer. And let's say I'm going, I don't know, 150 kilometers in between superchargers. So that's 4,000 watts, which is 4 kilowatt hours, 4,000 watt hours. And let's see, I have a 70D. Oops. So that's almost 6% of my battery. And keep in mind, you know, when you use TripAdvisor, it gives you the green light to leave when it predicts that you'll have 20% of your battery left at your destination. So, and TripAdvisor can easily be off by 10 percentage points. So if you find out that you're using 6% of your battery more than you thought in a previous leg, that can be kind of significant. And it's more significant in a smaller battery because it's a higher percentage. If you have an 85 kilowatt hour or kilowatt hour or a 90 or now the 100, you know, for that difference, which is 4 kilowatt hours, is much less significant. So here's going eastward. So this is coming from California to Michigan. And so this is basically the reverse of that data, but I was a little bit better about recording stuff. So I started out with like minimal changes in elevation, you know, in the hundreds of feet. And then the first big one was a gain of 830. Oh wait, okay. That's right. For this one, this is in feet, but I divided it by 3 just so I wouldn't have such high numbers. So I wanted to squash the extremes here. So I divided by 3. So this is actually probably meters, I guess. But I kept this in, this is watt hours per mile. And I guess the units aren't showing up. That's kind of unfortunate. But anyways, it's the bar graphs that are important. You can see the visual. So you can see with the significant gain of altitude there, I went from using 299 watt hours per mile to 317, which isn't a huge difference. But again, over long distances it is. And then Green River, Utah, which was a significant decrease in altitude, my energy went down, and so on and so forth. And then, let's see, and then here's something interesting. So Glenwood Springs is in the middle of Colorado, and then to get to Denver, you have to go through Silverthorne, which is like super high. I don't have Silverthorne on here because I didn't actually stop to charge. I was able to get to Silverthorne, and then if you're going eastward after Silverthorne to Denver, it's mostly downhill. So with the regen and stuff, I was able to reach Denver without having to stop and charge. So that's why it's not on here. And then, so it gets more interesting once you get to Kansas. You know, coming out of Colorado, you're losing quite a bit of elevation as you go back to Middle America. And you can see as I have less and less of a descent in altitude, my energy consumption gets quite high here. The highest is 343. And this is an area of Kansas that, at least on my vehicle, it consistently, TripAdvisor consistently underestimates the amount of energy that I need. because 343 on a smooth, flat freeway is that's quite a high watt hour per mile to use. Probably it might be related to the fact that when it's so straight out there, you go faster, and then the resistance and air resistance and stuff, and plus Kansas is flat out there in those areas, and so you get a lot of wind, and so that makes your energy consumption even higher. So it's kind of an enigma, at least the couple of times that I've gone through it. And then it sort of levels off here when the changes are less stark. So that's what I have for that. So let's go back to the raw data, and I wanted to mention, so this is coming back to Michigan. Where's my charge time? So coming back, I spent 9.5 hours charging for an average of 35 minutes at each charge place, which is roughly the same than the other one. It's a little bit different because when I was overnight, most of these I could charge, leave it at the supercharger actually, but there was one or two that I didn't on the way out. I think it was in Silverthorne actually that I had the car at the hotel, and then in the morning I went and supercharged. So that kind of throws off like the total charging time because I didn't count the time that I was sleeping and the car was charging. So 35 is really high. If you go to, let's go to Tesla's site. Here we go. So supercharger profile. Oh, okay. So they say 40 minutes to 80%. That actually is pretty accurate, based on the 90 kilowatt hour model. And so I think probably about 40 minutes. I haven't actually done a full time test of the supercharging, so I don't know exactly like how long it takes to get to 80% in my car, excluding weather extremes. But either way, let's say it is 40 minutes. 80% of my battery, which is 70 kilowatt hours, is a lot less miles in 40 minutes than the 90 kilowatt hour, because 80% of 90 is higher. So that's pretty significant. That doesn't, whoops, wrong page. There we go. That doesn't really matter if you are just going to one or two superchargers. If your chip just involves like one or two charging times. But if you're going to, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So that's 16 superchargers that I was at. Let's say that if you had a higher battery pack size, you saved, let's say 10 minutes each. So 16 times 10, oops, it's not working. Well, okay, 16 times 10 is 160. So that's 160 minutes. Divide that by 60. That's 2.5 hours. So that would knock your, but I charge for a total of 9.5 hours. So that would reduce your charge time over 3 days by almost 30% if you save 10 minutes at each of these stops, which is conceivable if you go from a 70 to a 90 kilowatt hour battery. So on that regard, the 70D is perfectly fine for most of my driving, but I do wish when I'm on these longer trips that I had a bigger battery. One, so that it would charge faster, but also so that, like let's say you have the 100D, if you, let's see, don't I have, oh, here we go. Okay, kilowatt hours per mile. So, it kind of looks like I'm averaging in the low 300s, let's say 310. And let's say on a 100 kilowatt hour battery, you actually have 95. 95 usable. So that's 306 miles at a full charge. So if you had a full charge, that means you could realistically have 300 miles. Most of the distances here are way less than that. I mean, look at, you're in the either low hundreds, sometimes 90s. So you could quite easily skip a supercharger. And you might think, well, but you can charge faster than you can save energy when you're going slow, right? Well, consider this situation. Oh, I skipped it here. Normal, Illinois, right here. So Country Club Hills is below Chicago, and then to get to Springfield, you go through Normal, Illinois. And the thing about the Normal, Illinois supercharger is that it's off the freeway, and it takes like 10 minutes just to get to it. And then obviously it takes 10 minutes to get back. So you spend like an extra 20 minutes getting to and from this supercharger, plus the time that you're actually supercharging. And if you're only charging for 20 minutes, you know, that doubles the time that you're there. So that would be an example of one that would be nice to skip. And I actually did that on the way back. I stayed in Springfield, Illinois, and then I skipped Normal, and I got to Country Club Hills, which was a total of 188 miles, which my realistic range is probably like 215, maybe 220, being pretty conservative with driving. So that's about as big as my comfort level gets, is going 180 miles. And I had charged up almost completely at Springfield. And that's all in my videos, if you want to see that adventure. I think that's probably in like the 8th episode or something like that. 8th or 9th. Yeah, so that's that. What else? So we talked about kilowatt hours. Charge to, oh, I wanted to mention this. So when you get to a destination, let's say you're in Barstow and you get to Primm, Nevada, which by the way, I skipped the Vegas one. That's another one that's kind of off the beaten track. So that was nice to skip that one. And okay, so you get to Primm, Nevada, and the car says like you used 304 watt hours per mile. And then you're like, okay, my next destination is St. George, and that is 163 miles away. So how many, how much am I roughly going to need to do that? Well, let's assume that your energy use is going to be the same. You pull out your handy dandy abacus and you say, okay, so it's 163 miles. And for each of those miles, you're going to use 0.304 kilowatt hours. Boom. So you're going to need almost 50 kilowatts to get to the next place based on your previous charging. And let's see what I used. So when I got to St. George, I used 48.7 kilowatt hours to get there. So back in the old days, before TripAdvisor was around, and if any of you watched Bjorn Neeland's videos back then, he was always doing his secret Asian calculations in the car and calculating how much he needed to charge because the car didn't do it for him at that time. And this is how he would do it. He knew about how much he was going to use, and he knew how many miles it was going to be. And then the car tells you as it's charging, like, okay, you've received 45 kilowatt hours, and then you just wait till you have enough. So that's how that works. So that's my data. I can't think of anything else to mention here. The cross-country trips and the charging and all that is super fun. I really like it. I hope to do it again. Would love to do it in a Model X. I don't have one. I don't know if I'll have one anytime soon either. But someday. And yeah, so a couple people have asked like if I've made this available publicly. I haven't, but I'm certainly willing to if there's somewhere to put the data, or somebody would like it. I mean, none of this is personal or anything, so I'm happy to share it if there's somewhere to do that. So yeah, if you have any questions or comments or whatever, feel free to put that below. And I hope this has been interesting. I'll see you in the next video.